I think we're going to start things off, even though there's still some people in the back. It is very hot on the panel. I do agree. Hello and welcome to our roundtable discussion on shaping the future of science communication. My name is Rebecca Winkels. I'm the Director of Communications and Strategy at Wissenschaft im Dialog. But today I'm going to hold back and just foster the discussion on science engagement and the future of it. Our panel today is all about the future of science engagement, and we're going to look at things we can do, things we can improve, and especially going to look at the way science communication can be a key determinator on fostering dialogue and fostering and helping to tackle the global challenges we're currently facing. I mean, some of them we all know by having to wear face masks today. Before we kick things off, just a few things. This is a hybrid event, so we will be able to ask questions on the panel. You can see a microphone standing over there. And we will also be able to pose questions in the chat that will then be moderated onto the panel. And you will be addressed directly by my co-moderator, who's hiding somewhere in the back. I can't see her because of the lights. But to keep this quick and have as much time for the discussion, I'm just going to briefly introduce our panel today. I'm joined by Nick Ismail-Perkins, who is a program lead on public value of science at the International Science Council and an expert on participatory global development and has been working in the area for years. Hi, nice to meet you.
Thank you for having me.
Then we're doing male first round here. That's terrible. It's just because the other ones are so much more important. Insulting a panel is always a great way to start as a moderator. Rodrigo Tapia Seaman is sitting in between the women here. He's the head of Science and Society Division of the Ministry of Science, Technology, Knowledge and Innovation in Chile. And then to the far left, we have Tina Stengele, who's the Program Director, Science and Society at the Robert Bosch Society. And we're also joined by Wiebke Rössig, who's the Director of Science and Society at the Falling Walls Foundation. And last but not least, I'm very happy to welcome Kai Mugo, the Public Engagement Lead at the Mazago Institute in Kenya, who is with us today because she's been elected to speak on behalf of a group of science engagement practitioners from all over the world who had a similar discussion, and so she's now going to bring the things that were said down there to our panel today. And she's also the hub manager for Falling Walls Engage in Kenya. So very happy to welcome you all to the panel. The way we're going to kick things off is I'm going to just pose 2 questions to everyone, and then we have a bit of commentary on that later on as well. So the first question, and I'm going to start with Tina Stengele on the left. How can we foster participatory and co-creative science engagement projects or initiatives that aim to tackle global challenges? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts on that are that there are various ways to tackle them. And I would like to outline 3. One would be to, of course, as a funding institution, either private or public, and I'm here on the panel to present the funding perspective. So I think what we can do is provide funding to scientists and also to organizations that do engage in participatory and co-creative projects. That would be one thing. The second thing would also be to showcase best practice and professionalize the field. And the third thing, which is probably the hardest to reach, would be to contribute to the recognition of science engagement efforts in science. So I would like to mention Falling Walls Engage, which you probably attended yesterday, and a lot of engagers are around here. I see a couple of familiar faces, which is great. So we initiated that project in 2018 together with the Falling Walls Foundation because we think that it is important to have an international platform of science engagement. And we did that because we think that science engagement is more than publishing scientific findings in magazines. We think that that reach is only part of society, but it is important to reach out a bigger part of society as well, especially those who are rarely or not at all in touch with academia or with science. And we think that is so important because if people turn away from rational and from evidence-based values, I think that's a real threat for democracies and for societies. To highlight the successful science engagement project might help, or hopefully helps, to change perspective in science as well as in society. And so you probably know that Falling Walls Engage has 3 components. One is sort of a competitive component because we select the breakthrough of the year, which is going to be on stage on the main hall tomorrow. And the second thing, which is also very important to us and which I think that funding institutions can really make a difference, is to offer a network component. And I think from the engagers who are around here, they can tell you more about it. I think it's so important to offer a platform where people can meet and exchange experience and knowledge. And the third component is a vision or the idea of an International Year of Science Engagement, which I think we're going to hear about probably a bit later on. So to sum up, I think funding institutions can, with formats just like this that I just highlighted, they can reach out to the public. They can also help professionalize the field and also contribute to the recognition of science engagement in society that, were the 3 issues that I mentioned at the very beginning. So that's sort of in short the thoughts that came to my mind on your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. We're going to continue with Nick. What are your thoughts on the issue?
So I also have 3 points, but they have sub-clauses. So the first is actually, and I'm going to be probably a little bit provocative here, and I feel like, because I don't know how many of you know the International Science Council, but it's basically a membership body of around 200 disciplinary unions, science academies, regional research institutions. And this issue has been exercising the membership quite a bit over the last few years for various reasons. So these thoughts are informed by these kind of conversations. And the first is, I think we really need to have researchers take the science of science communication seriously. And this has a number of implications. The first is actually around disaggregating audiences. I think that oftentimes when we talk about science communication, we talk about the public. There is no such thing. And many political campaigners will tell you that there is no such thing, and you would never win a campaign if you went about talking about the public. You need to think about constituencies, you need to think about identities, groups and markers and that kind of stuff. The other thing that actually is sort of associated with that is the need to look empirically at what has worked when we talk about building constructive engagement with science. And there's more that could be said about that, but I'll leave that there for the moment. The second significant factor is challenging this narrative that we have about how science works, which is specifically the idea of the hero scientist, which goes back to Einstein. The idea that basically you have one brilliant scientist who sits down in a lab somewhere and generates amazing breakthroughs, and that's really what's the heart of science, as opposed to the fact that it's actually a deeply multidisciplinary, very collaborative process of systematically, very incrementally diminishing uncertainty. And this is very different from the way that we tend to communicate about science at the moment. And the problem with that is that is twofold. First of all, it means it's very difficult to communicate uncertainty, which is a real problem, and it's where we start to see a lot. It really allows for co-option and a lot of resistance. This issue around kind of the adverse engagement with science practice comes from, like, again, this idea of people who are able to take advantage of uncertainty, and we need to find a better way to address that. And the other thing actually about this hero narrative is that it doesn't really allow very well for us to engage in the co-creation of science. And so, for instance, I know that the UK Research Institute right now is talking. They have this campaign they call 101 Jobs, and they want to start profiling people who are doing science. And they said that actually, they do quite a lot of research funding in the Antarctic, and the first person that they profiled was the chef, because they said actually, it's very difficult to do research in the Antarctic if you don't have a good cook. And so that kind of stuff is really, I think, perspective building and really important. And then the third area that I really want to draw attention to is this issue around thinking about the position that scientists have. So oftentimes I think scientists think that actually they're ahistorical, asocial, they're above the institutions and the structures. Their expertise allows them somehow not to worry about things like the negotiation of values and contestation of politics and political narratives. But the reality is that, of course, it's going to be socialized. All science is socialized. And they really need to be thinking about this. And also, what's important about thinking about positionality is then you also allow yourself to see, also can see where you are in society relative to the other people that make up society, and the importance of diversity, which is also really significant if we want to have constructive engagement with the public more generally. I'm going to stop there because I think you're giving me that look that I use as a moderator when I want people to stop.
At least that interpretation and communication stuff is working. So, Carrie, what are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about the desegregation of communities when we're talking about public engagement. And one thing that really emerged out of the conversations that we were having as Science Engages was really thinking about the communities that we're trying to impact. So we found that we are all sort of working at communities that are either hard to reach or underrepresented when we talk about science. And we're trying to think about how do we encourage them to see themselves within science, which can feel very siloed, it can feel very exclusive. And some of the ideas that really came out were really considering what are the perceptions of the communities that we are talking to. What do they think of science? And we often talk of broad science, and so are we using the language that is identifiable to them? Are we speaking to the things that are important to them? And if not, how do we change that, right? So trying to encourage communities at the very beginning to be involved in our own thinking of science engagement. And the other thing that really came out to us about how we can embed co-creation and really think about how to co-create knowledge and disseminate knowledge in a way that is inclusive is really to think about what existing expertise there is in these communities or existing resources. So in many of the communities that we're looking at, there are people who are, scientists, but not necessarily in an academic sense. So how do we bring in these people that have traditional influence, traditional knowledge in the work that we're trying to do in science engagement? And I can see somebody nodding here who's an astronomer who does really great work around, traditional sky knowledge, which I think is really crucial and important. And I think in this way, then, we're really empowering underrepresented groups to see themselves in not only the solutions we're coming up with, but the innovations, and to encourage them to take part in something that includes them from the very beginning. So really just thinking through how can we do science engagement in a more participatory manner that is bottom up rather than top down, I think is my thought on this. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Rodrigo, why don't you finish?
Thanks. I kind of agree with what you've said, so I'm just going to try to refer to something else. What we've been kind of trying to understand is that when you talk about participation or you talk about engagement, you're kind of discussing culture, like how culture works. And culture is a hard thing to study, and it's a hard approach to measure, which is something that we scientists like to do. But it's really interesting and important to try to understand what's happening there. So how can you promote that kind of cultural changes? How can you promote to put incentives? I work in the state, and we just, most of the science in Chile is public money, and it's given through proposals. So we basically do kind of open calls for different things. And so the tool that we have is just to decide where you put the money and what you're going to ask to all those proposals. So when you start like thinking about what happens in terms of the culture, you will see that you go like to the pretty basic thing, which is curiosity. And it's like, we all have that. So it's like, how do you, like reach out to the curiosity that like normally is kind of not very taken care of in our educational system. So one example that I could give is that we wanted to give funding to communities, not to scientists who want to go to communities, but communities itself. So we created an open call for any like civil communities. We have a very like specific kind of basically neighborhoods communities. And we gave them money to, I mean, there's always this idea of like fixing problems, and which is something that there's always is. But there's also curiosity. So we just gave them money to either like answer questions that they have or to like fix problems or needs that they have. And it's been really interesting because they just apply to this, telling us why do they need science somehow to, like do this approach. And we call it like local knowledge dissemination. So they just, they have to work somehow with a specialist. They have to find them. But the specialist is working around the subjects that these communities really care and they want to do. So I think that when you try to see, like the small thing, how it's happening, and you try to, try to understand how a cultural change is going to happen, then this two-way thing that we talk about, it's just natural. It's not like the intention. So it just happened when you try to understand what's happening in the community itself.
Thank you very much. Wiebke, it's your last but not least turn. Add to that.
That's always difficult because so many things have been said already. Yeah, I think what is really important is what we are speaking about, actually, science engagement is for us meant in a participatory co-creational way. So I think it's always important to start with the question why actually we really want to foster the co-creative and participatory way. And I myself, I just believe strongly that multiple perspectives make everything more efficient and better and more adaptable and accessible. So including different knowledges and experiences does not only make decisions and debates broader and better, but also science and scientific research itself. So bringing knowledge across is not enough. We are seeing that now in the pandemic, but with climate change debate, so this is definitely not enough. So in order to make a difference, I believe we really have to work together and uniting all these different expertises and finding sustainable and evidence-based answers to the global problems. So I think defining why actually are we doing this, and then defining with whom and for whom we are doing that. Like Nick already defined, there is not the public, and there's definitely not one group of the public either, but really going into detail into with whom are we actually working and trying to get as many perspectives on board is really important. And then I think the next question is like, how do we foster that? And I think the most crucial part, Tina mentioned that, is our joint project Engage is focusing on, is an exchange between all these different expertises on science engagement and taking the research on science engagement serious, not only the scientific research, but also the practical research, trying out and being curious about what actually works out, and then exchanging best practices. And so I think we need to, so to wrap that up, so we need to, one, lower the barriers of how can we engage, so it's make it easy, accessible, possible for everyone. via a language that is accessible, physical accessibility and time, but also create a clear benefit for all those who are participating. So really define who is actually with us and how do we create a benefit for everyone. And a benefit can be anything, yeah, it can be just fun or acknowledgement or alignment with own goals or a connection to their own daily life. So, and of course time or financing regarding the scientists. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for those ideas. I think those are great projects. We've heard about some solutions for them. We heard about what we need to do to foster science engagement now. One thing we were always having in the back of our mind is funding and is institutionalizing things. So what are your thoughts? And we're going to start with you, Wiebke, to not make it very hard on you all the time. What are your ideas on how can we contribute to the institutionalization of science engagement?
Yeah. Well, everybody always wants science engagement, kind of, but then only very few engage in it. So from the scientist side, so that's mostly a lack of financial resources and time resources, personnel. So changing the funding part of that would help, definitely, but also the recognition and the acknowledgement of science engagement done by researchers, by scientists. But then I also think a commitment really to do this is very important. So in Falling Walls Engage, we have made the commitments to action initiated in the Falling Walls Engage hub in Kenya in March 2020, you remember? And we have two approaches at Falling Walls Engage to do that, and I think there are definitely more ways to do that, but like our approaches are, one is that we aim to make science engagement an intrinsic part for all stakeholders, and we hope to do that via lobbying, of course, for better funding and time, but also by skill sharing and building expertise in scientists, but also in science engagers who are working with scientists and communities, connecting them. And we are trying to do that regionally in the Falling Walls Engage hubs, and we're trying that via the initiatives. Tina mentioned that already on the International Year of Science Engagement, with the idea to ask the UN to call out an International Year of Science Engagement for the year 2025. To really showcase science engagement, make it more visible, connect science engagers, scientists who are interested in that, skill sharing, and create a global community of science engagers. And secondly, we are aiming to create our own showcase for this year as a perspective, a longer-term perspective of inclusive, meaningful interactions, connecting the local and the global, the grassroots and the leadership perspective. And the working title for that is Cascading Debates. And you've all been here today, seen debates happening in different formats in the plenary tables. You might have attended one in the lecture hall or here in this smaller setting or an even smaller setting in background tables. And we want to build on this and this moment that we create at Falling Walls Science Summit, where we have global leaders in science and from the policymaking side, from the company leaders. And we would like to create in initiatives of several debates on one topic taking place locally all over the world on the same topic, and creating formats of collecting messages, knowledges, experiences, questions, remarks, whatever comes up in these local debates, connect that and transport that into our plenary table debates. And so our really far away goal still is that maybe by the year 2025, an International Year of Science Engagement, we can host several tables where we discuss, and we know that everyone around the world has had the possibility to somehow be represented as a community in these debates. So this is one thing that we try to do for institutionalization.
Okay, thank you very much. Rodrigo, you talked a lot about local initiatives and stuff like that, but what can that achieve, and how can we achieve institutionalization in that area, or is that even an area we want to have institutionalized?
Well, the Ministry of Science, which is where I work, it's new formed. We only had 2 years. And so what I've been working on these past 2 years is just to create an institution like for science and society. But what it's interesting is that we had like a couple of decades ago, as I said before, science and research in Chile is funded by the government through, like open calls and kind of a contest system. And one of those contest systems for centers of research did something very particular, which was like giving them the possibility to apply for extra funding to do outreach. So when that started to happen, suddenly we started to see like different, and I think in part because a lot of the scientists, me included, wanted to do something different to do research. And with that extra money, we had the opportunity to create activities, to do outreach, being in the university. So that just started to happen, and I would say that the past 10 years it's been really changing. Like there's more and more projects and people interested in doing science communication. In the beginning it was like, oh, like scientists would look it down, like if you want to do communication was something second. But now it's just been changing. So it's interesting how all the process, I was working on that kind of outreach for 10 years, and now 2 years ago we decided start working on the ministry and in this thing. So it's a very good sign of how all these cultural changes that happen inside the research centers eventually lead to an institutionalization of science and society within the ministry. So what we've been doing these 2 years is try to see, okay, now we're an institution, how we foster all these changes. And the first thing to do, I think I have 30 seconds. The first thing to do for us was like, okay, science in Chile is mainly like contest things. So, but contests were always seen like, like just a competition, who wins and blah. So the main work was to design all these proposals to see what do we want to happen in society. So I think that all this community working, I think that will eventually like be kind of institutionalized. Because I don't really feel like I like to use that word for like the system, maybe just for the government or the foundations. So I think the institutionalization is interesting and it's needed, especially for the scientific and research system and from the government. But then since you're in that position, you have to see ways of, let things happen with some kind of vision that you have. Like.
Thank you very much. Kari, as someone who leads one of those hubs Wiebke was talking about, tell us a bit about that.
I realized I sat at the best place because I'm halfway between everything happening. But I think one thing that emerged for us and that has been mentioned here is that really science engagers are looking for funding, that we are not going to be able to do the work we want to do without the right kind of funding. And one idea that came out of our discussion was the idea of institutionalizing quotas for science engagement when people are applying for research projects, whether at the institutional or individual level, that we say, and I think this is from Chile actually, that we say there's 20% that has to go towards science engagement, right? And so there is a commitment and a value argument being made that science engagement is a crucial part of the research process. It's not just simply going out and doing the hard science, but you then have to find a way to communicate the science to your constituents. So really thinking about how do we make this value argument, and so funding for science engagement that is dedicated and built into research funding, I think is really crucial. And secondary to that is really thinking through how we can increase formal training and opportunities for science engagement. And I think that by doing this, both within, the for-profit sector and within our institutions of higher learning and other areas where we are learning, we can then not only improve the quantity of science engagement training opportunities, but also improve the quality, improve the methodology, improve the learning that we have, improve the evaluation, and really just institutionalize science engagement in all these areas where science is already happening. So I think those are my two takeaways.
Thank you very much. Nick, what are your takeaways on?
So I think that if we're going to be serious about this, we have to recognize that there's a bit of a tension here, right? So on one hand, we have to challenge this idea about what scientific practice is. Everybody's talked about, yeah, we need to kind of not have it a little add-on. It has to be really quite fundamental. But at the same time, if we're doing that, we also need to recognize that you'll need different strategies for institutionalization depending on different disciplines, different contexts in which science is practiced. And so what I want to do is give 3 examples where I think we can kind of start to address that a little bit. So the first comes from, again, some work that the ISC is doing, and we just had a report done around the transdisciplinary research work that we've been supporting, which calls for a commission to support mission-oriented science models. And the idea of that is basically looking not only at the funding models, but also looking really at the organizational and institutional models which have worked or which could work if you're going to be, so if you're organizing for large global issues, how are we actually facilitating science practice in a way that really will deliver on that kind of stuff? So that's really important. And there, you know, then science communication is not an add-on, it's completely fundamental to this idea of mission-oriented science. The second thing is, so as you've mentioned, you know, I work with this project called The Public Value of Science, and one of the things that we've been doing is actually trying to really make the case for the science of science communication and building a program of capacity support for various disciplinary institutions and regional bodies. And as part of that, developing different models of what we call pilot campaigns. So because the reality is that science engagement, public perceptions of science has to be very localized. It's very much refracted through local contexts, around structural relationships, historical continuities. And so what we would like to do is to stop thinking about, you know, kind of a silver bullet for what's going to happen across the world, but think really about what can work in different contexts and working with different partnerships, and particularly going for those partners who are outside of the science, the traditional science community. So thinking about trade unions, for instance, religious groups that are really fundamental in changing, in shaping people's perceptions of the world and making meaning of it. And then the third thing is actually, you know, coming back into this idea of the International Year of Science Engagement, it is worth saying that there is a lot of examples of stuff where that has not worked, but there's some really profound examples of where that kind of stuff has worked. Because the advantage of an international year is that you can really bring together a broad church and a broad coalition, and it allows you to engage lots of people who may be at the end of their journey, people who might be at the beginning of their journey, and you see how that's worked with the International Year for Polar Science in the 1950s, and that was really a game changer. And I think that, you know, thinking about this as not necessarily as a single activity, but thinking about it as a convening of ideas could be really useful.
Tina, from someone's perspective who's actually funding a lot of science communication or whose organization is, what do you think on that?
Well, I have 2 thoughts on the institutionalization of science engagement. One is that I think that we need prove and show the impact of science engagement. I think you mentioned that earlier, Nick. And Rebecca, you would know better than I do that there's an organization in Germany which just created an impact hub in order to find out what what approaches do work. And so I'm convinced that the demand for participatory science and other ways of being in touch with society will grow. So I guess that institutions like this, you know, there's others in the world out there, but institutions like this, they're rather important to show that science engagement has an impact and helps to break the wall.
Thank you for the free marketing. Thank you.
Yeah. We didn't talk about it earlier, didn't we? And the second thought that I have is rather an example, actually, that I would like to share with the audience. It's a project offering universities the possibility to connect with the community they are based in. It's a project called Science Man, and it developed sort of a toolkit for any science institutions to get in touch with the communities they're based in. And this toolkit can be downloaded from our website, and it's in German and in English, so you can look it up. We developed that because we are convinced that science has to be in closer touch with society and with the people around them. And a lot of times we see formats where the expert opinion is really in the center, and it sometimes scares away people and makes it hard to get in real dialogue. So this is a really cooperative format where dialogue is on the focus, and where we're inviting ordinary people and scientists, so to speak, to get in touch and to have very personal encounters and open for conversations. And we tried that 2 times, and the learnings from that are based in the toolkit. So that might also be something that could, be an example for other institutions to use and to make science engagement more like an everyday job in institutions.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, thanks for the advertisement. We have, before we open the round for the ordinary people, are we calling that? We're going to have a special guest here with us today. Stefan Delfs has agreed to join us, and he's now lowering his mask so you can see him. He's the head of the Division of Higher Education, Science and Research at the Federal Foreign Office in Germany, and he has agreed to say a few words on and comment on what the experts on science communication have so far said. So if you would kindly agree to offer your comments and thoughts.
Well, thanks a lot. That was a great session, and I feel very animated. And I think I was asked as well to give a few examples what we do at the Foreign Office here in Berlin. Traditionally, we basically were funding scholarships for student scientists to come to Germany, then go back and tell everyone what a great country Germany is. So that was the way it was done before. Since a number of years, we have shifted a bit more towards output, and output in the sense of how to contribute to reaching the SDGs, to community work, to have as well an impact on societies, because that's what we do, exchanging views between society and, of course, to co-create in the field of expertise you're working on. I want to mention perhaps 3 examples that illustrate that a bit. One sounds traditional. It's the German Chancellor's scholarships. Now you say probably, well, that's another scholarship, great thing. But the idea there is that you can apply as a young, hopefully future leader with your project that should, as you mentioned, should benefit your home community, your home country, and if it works well, as well, the German research institution you're working at, and the local community. So if someone from Russia is working how to prevent the spreading of cities, that could have a lesson for all kind of cities, not only in Russia and Germany, but more globally. Or if you have one looking at the miracle of the German Mittelstand, these small, sometimes world leader companies in the middle of nowhere, that could be something to study indeed elsewhere. And of course all this is embedded you together with the other persons from Brazil, Russia, China, US and so on, so that this idea of making the world a better place within the framework you're working at is funded. One other example, completely different, is a Colombian German Peace Institute called CAPAS, where Colombian universities and German universities have teamed up not only to study the peace process, which of course, as most people know, is a very different one and goes on and on. And so the idea is, well, to create momentum for the process, to learn from the mistakes people are doing, to involve the local communities, the NGOs, the government perspective, and to create a forum. And if things go well, we're thinking about trying to have this model as well to imitate it in other parts of the world. And the last example I wanted to mention are global centers from the German Academic Exchange Service, where we are working on health issues and climate change issues. And these centers are run by researchers from the Global South that make the call, that apply, and then, of course, there's a link to Germany, but the most important one is that they have a real outcome and that they're well rooted within their societies. Yeah, perhaps that's good for the moment.
Thank you very much. So we've now heard about some pretty amazing projects. We've heard about some solutions for the future. And this gives us some time to open the floor for audience questions to any of our panelists or Mr. Delfs as well, I think. Any questions from the audience? Feel free to step up to the open mic.
Hi. I'm wondering, does Europe have something like the Creative Coalition in the United States? It's an organization of popular entertainment people, movie stars, directors, etc., whose whole purpose is fostering belief in science and awareness of pertinent science facts with the public using pop media?
Has anyone heard of anything alike, or would anyone like to comment if that's a good idea or not, maybe?
I mean, I don't know of a coalition quite like that, but of course there are lots of examples of drawing on popular culture to raise awareness or to facilitate engagement with various science initiatives. I mean, certainly in the UK, this is what's been happening with the recent COVID vaccine drive as one example. In fact, also interestingly, the commission that I just referred to, this Commission for Mission-Oriented Science, we have James Cameron potentially on that commission, and that's partly because actually what we're doing is, I mean, actually I should probably not have said that. But the idea is that basically we recognize the value of the creative industries in that kind of engagement.
All right, thank you very much. There's two more questions. Yeah, we have time for two very quick questions.
So I have a question about impact. Mónica Feliu, Mujer Ciencia, Puerto Rico. Often when impact is measured is about numbers, but my experience working with marginalized communities is that impact is also relationships, and those are hard to measure. Those also take time. It's not something that in a year you can build a relationship. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that, measuring that kind of impact.
Well, from my perspective, it's definitely not just numbers, and impact in that sense has all the aspects that you just mentioned. So I think we need to think about clever ways on how to measure that and how to show that impact in that sense, and science engagement does have an impact, and even if it's not just measures or numbers that you can put. So that's
I would totally agree, and I think only quantitative methods to measure impact totally fail to measure that really. So I think qualitative methods of really going into depth into what relationships will build up, what perception changes were made is far more important actually when we measure science engagement impact.
Thank you very much. And we have one last question from the audience.
Hello there. Thank you very much for your views. It's not necessarily a question, it could be a statement for discussion. We've all been in this field for a number of years, and in my opinion, the last two have been very transformative. personally have been running an organization that for the first 10 years had to explain to everybody why it's important to communicate science. It was always a bonus, it was always a nice to have. We were all coming here, the same people, we knew each other, we liked each other, but it was a micro view, it wasn't a macro view of what's happening. And then COVID-19 came, and all of a sudden scientists became the superheroes. There was an article in the New York Times in April 2020 talking about scientists being the new superheroes. And it was a transformation that we very much needed, despite the tragedy of the people who died. And I think that this conversation has an opportunity to be case study specific. It's a pity that we don't use, for example, COVID-19 case, which was an easy one to tackle compared to climate change. And use it to learn conclusions and lessons from that. Example, we have the anti-vacciners community. This is a target group, about 35% of the global population, that we have the opportunity to study. It's not necessarily the facts that they're missing from us science communicators. A lot of studies are talking about not having the trust they need to the influences that influence them. So in order to conclude my statement, I think that from now on, the discussions need to be case study specific. It helps very much, and study very much our audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think those were great closing remarks as we are now running out of time slowly. Any last comment on that one from the podium?
I would add, because I agree that this is an interesting case for like study something very specific, which is health and all that. But I also think that this the trust that we are trying to find, I don't think it's something that we just have to find like good ways of somehow show the people that science is important. I think that most of the focus of engagement is just put over the engagers. And so I think that we just need to and like try to see that the final focus is just the people. And I think that what we've learned somehow about the pandemic and what we've lived about it is that the hardest part is the uncertainty. And the uncertainty is something related, it's like the opposite. I mean, it's the drive that moves curiosity because our brain is not happy with not knowing, And I think that there is something deep in there, which is the need that we all have to understand the world we're living. And I think the pandemic is just one example, but I think that everything will eventually go down to that point. And it's like, that's why you need to foster somehow curiosity, and because if you understand the world you live in, you somehow feel better. It's like, I'm a scientist and I didn't know what's going to happen with COVID, but I kind of understood how these things work, and somehow it's like, okay, it's uncertainty, but you know something. But most of the people doesn't, and I think that's the thing.
Thank you very much, Nick. You're getting the last remarks.
I was just going to say, actually, I think you're right. I think it was a really interesting comment for us to end the session on for two reasons. One is that actually it really challenges, focusing on anti-vaxxers is really interesting, and I think one of the more profound ideas I've heard about the future of science engagement lately is to think that science engagement or science communication is really about social cohesion. It's not about teaching scientific evidence, right? And I think that's really quite profound if we think it through. But the other thing is actually, I would say, again though, sort of, if we apply the same reflexivity that we expect of others to ourselves, we think, so case studies for who? Who are we trying to convince with the case studies, and do we know that's what they need? And here I'm thinking about the rest of the science community, because I know that, again, within the science community that I engage with, there are people who think this is a bit of moral panic. It was all fine. In the end, most people got vaccinated. What's the problem? And we don't know, actually, at what extent that anti-vaxxers become a public health problem and how much of a public health problem they might become. Because we just kind of but we operate with this idea. I mean, I'm not suggesting, to be clear, that I'm not defending anti-vaxxers at all. But what we need to be able to do is to be able to find ways of quantifying this, so that, because that's where you start to make a case for some of those scientists who think, oh, but in the end, it's okay for the most part.
All right, thank you very much. We are out of time now, and so we're going to close the panel now. Thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you for the audience for the lovely questions.